The American presidency was born out of fear as much as hope. When the United States emerged from revolution in the late 18th century, its founders were not dreaming of creating the most powerful leader on earth. They were trying to avoid exactly that. Kings had ruled them from across the ocean, taxing without consent and commanding armies without accountability. The idea of placing too much authority in the hands of one man felt dangerous, even un-American. And yet, the nation they created demanded leadership. Someone had to command the army, conduct diplomacy, and hold the fragile union together. Thus, the presidency was designed as a compromise strong enough to function, weak enough to be controlled. George Washington stepped into this role with deep hesitation. He was already a national hero, a general who could have seized power if he wanted to. Instead, he set the most important precedent of all. The president would serve the nation, not rule it. Washington avoided royal language, rejected calls to be addressed with grand titles, and voluntarily stepped down after 2 terms. His presidency reassured both Americans and foreign powers that this new republic was not another empire in disguise. But even in these early years, the office carried symbolic weight. European monarchies watched closely, uneasy about a nation proving that authority could exist without a crown. As Washington handed power to John Adams, the cracks in the system began to show. Adams inherited a world dominated by empires at war. Britain and France were locked in a global struggle, and both expected the young United States to choose a side. Instead, the American president tried to remain neutral, an idea that sounds simple but proved dangerous. French agents interfered in American politics. British ships seized American sailors. For the first time, foreign powers tested how far they could push the U.S. president. The presidency was still weak, but it was already becoming a target not because of what it could destroy, but because of what it represented: independence. Thomas Jefferson expanded that meaning even further. With the Louisiana Purchase, the president effectively doubled the size of the United States with a single decision. There was no war, no revolution, just a signature. Foreign powers took notice. If one man could reshape a continent through diplomacy, then the presidency was far more powerful than its creators had imagined. Jefferson spoke of peace and limited government, yet his actions revealed a truth that would define the office forever: crises expand presidential power. Every unexpected challenge pushed the boundaries of what the president could do. And once expanded, those boundaries rarely shrank again. As the 19th century progressed, America grew louder, larger, and more confident. Presidents were no longer just caretakers of a fragile experiment. They were leaders of an expanding nation pushing westward, absorbing territory, displacing native populations, and clashing with neighboring powers. Each expansion brought new attention from abroad. Spain, Britain, and later Mexico saw the United States not as a curiosity, but as a competitor. The president became the face of that competition. To oppose American growth meant opposing the president himself. Then came the moment that permanently changed the meaning of the office: the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln did not merely lead a country. He fought to keep one alive. Faced with rebellion, Lincoln took actions no previous president had dared: suspending habeas corpus, expanding the military, and asserting federal authority over states. In doing so, he transformed the presidency into a wartime command center. When Lincoln was assassinated, the message was unmistakable. Killing the president was no longer just a crime, it was an attack on the nation's survival. From that moment forward, the world understood that the American president was inseparable from American power. By the dawn of the 20th century, the presidency was accelerating beyond its original design. Industrialization, global trade, and imperial competition demanded faster decisions and stronger leadership. Theodore Roosevelt embraced this shift openly. He spoke of America as a global force and used the presidency to project power abroad. Building the Panama Canal, mediating international conflicts, and expanding the Navy, Roosevelt redefined the president as a global actor. Foreign nations no longer negotiated with Congress or state governments. They negotiated with the man in the White House. World War I and World War II completed this transformation. Under Woodrow Wilson and Franklin D. Roosevelt, the president became the voice of America to the world. War mobilization placed enormous authority in executive hands. By the time atomic weapons entered the equation, the presidency had crossed a threshold no office in history ever had before. One person now held the power to end civilizations. Allies depended on the American president for protection. Enemies feared him as a potential executioner. Neutral countries watched nervously, knowing that a single decision could alter their fate. The Cold War locked this reality into place. American presidents were no longer just leaders of a nation. They were guardians of a global system. They decided where armies would be deployed, which governments would survive, and which economies would be strangled by sanctions. This level of influence guaranteed opposition. Rival powers targeted the presidency indirectly through espionage, propaganda, proxy wars, and assassination plots. Challenging the president became synonymous with challenging American dominance itself. As technology evolved, so did the battlefield. The modern president operates in a world of instant communication, cyber warfare, and global markets. A speech can crash currencies. A tweet can move armies. Enemies no longer need bombs to target the presidency. They can destabilize it through information, division, and economic pressure. The office has become both more powerful and more vulnerable than ever before. This is the paradox at the heart of the American presidency. It was created to prevent tyranny, yet history turned it into the most consequential position on the planet. It was meant to be restrained, yet crises demanded expansion. And as its power grew, so did the number of those who sought to resist it. To understand why countries target American presidents today, one must understand this long evolution from reluctant leadership to global command. The presidency did not seek the world's attention. It earned it, one decision at a time. As the young republic survived its fragile beginnings, the presidency entered a far more aggressive and controversial phase. By the early 19th century, the United States was no longer just trying to exist, it was trying to expand. Population growth, economic ambition, and a growing sense of destiny pushed the nation outward, and the president became the engine of that movement. This era would redefine how the world viewed American leadership, transforming the president from a cautious administrator into a driving force of territorial power. The idea that America was meant to stretch from coast to coast did not emerge from law alone, it emerged from belief. Manifest destiny was not written into the Constitution, yet it guided presidential decisions with near religious intensity. Presidents began to see expansion not as conquest, but as fate. This belief made American actions difficult for foreign powers to negotiate with, because destiny cannot be compromised with. For neighboring nations and indigenous peoples, the president was no longer a distant figure in Washington. He was the face of loss, displacement, and irreversible change. Andrew Jackson embodied this shift more than any president before him. He was not a refined statesman shaped by elite circles, but a soldier forged by violence and frontier warfare. Jackson believed deeply in executive authority, especially when it came to enforcing federal will. Under his presidency, Native American tribes were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands, culminating in the Trail of Tears. From the president's perspective, this was national progress. From the outside world's perspective, it was a warning. The American president was willing to use power ruthlessly to achieve expansion, even at the cost of human suffering. Foreign governments watched carefully. European empires that still held colonies in the Americas began to see the United States as a direct threat to their influence. The Monroe Doctrine, proclaimed earlier, warned Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, but under expansionist presidents, that warning gained teeth. The president was no longer just defending independence. He was declaring regional dominance. To challenge American expansion meant challenging the authority and ambition of the presidency itself. This expansion reached a critical point under James K. Polk. In just 4 years, Polk oversaw one of the most dramatic territorial enlargements in history. Texas, California, and vast portions of the Southwest were absorbed into the United States. The Mexican-American War made it clear that the president could initiate conflict, shape its goals, and define its outcome. For Mexico and other nations, the lesson was harsh and unforgettable. The American president could redraw borders with force and emerge politically stronger for it. As America expanded, so did internal tension. Every new territory raised explosive questions about slavery, representation, and power. Presidents found themselves balancing expansion abroad with fracture at home. To foreign observers, this internal instability was an opportunity. A divided America was a weaker America, and weakening the presidency became a strategic goal. European powers speculated whether the United States might collapse under its own contradictions, just as older republics had before it. Then came Abraham Lincoln, and with him the ultimate test of presidential authority. The Civil War shattered any remaining illusion that the presidency was limited. Faced with rebellion on an unprecedented scale, Lincoln acted decisively, often controversially. He expanded executive powers, commanded massive armies, and treated the survival of the Union as a non-negotiable objective. Foreign powers, particularly Britain and France, considered intervening or recognizing the Confederacy. They understood that the outcome of this war would determine not only America's future, but the future balance of power. Lincoln's assassination marked a turning point that echoed far beyond U.S. borders. For the first time, the world saw that killing an American president was possible and that doing so could traumatize an entire nation. The presidency was no longer just a political office. It was a symbol whose destruction could destabilize a country. This realization would linger in the minds of adversaries for generations to come. After the Civil War, the presidency emerged stronger, not weaker. Reconstruction, industrialization, and economic growth placed new responsibilities on the executive branch. Railroads stretched across the continent, corporations grew to unprecedented size, and the federal government became more involved in everyday life. Presidents now influenced not just land and war, but labor, money, and industry. As American economic power grew, so did resentment abroad. Foreign competitors realized that the president's decisions could determine access to markets, trade routes, and resources. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had completed its continental expansion. But instead of reducing the presidency's power, this achievement prepared it for something larger. The nation had outgrown isolation. Its factories demanded raw materials, its economy demanded markets. Its navy demanded coaling stations and strategic ports. The president, once designed to avoid entanglement, now stood at the edge of global involvement. To the rest of the world, the message was unmistakable. The American president was no longer the leader of a former colony trying to survive. He was the representative of a rising power willing to reshape geography, politics, and lives in the name of national destiny. Countries that stood in the way were conquered, absorbed, or sidelined. Countries that watched from afar began planning how to contain, influence, or challenge this new force. This chapter of expansion planted the seeds of future conflict. It taught foreign nations that American presidents would not remain passive. It showed that moral language could mask hard power and that destiny could justify domination. Most importantly, it proved that the presidency itself was evolving, no longer bound strictly by the fears of its founders, but driven by the ambitions of a growing nation. And as the power of the office expanded westward across a continent, it also expanded outward toward the rest of the world. By the time the 19th century drew toward its close, the United States had survived its most dangerous internal collapse and emerged fundamentally changed. The Civil War did not simply preserve the Union. It permanently altered the balance of power between the states and the federal government, and nowhere was that shift more visible than in the presidency. Abraham Lincoln's wartime leadership had established a precedent that could never be fully undone. In moments of national emergency, the president would not wait for permission. He would act. The world took note, and so did America's enemies. In the years following Lincoln's assassination, the presidency carried a new gravity. The death of a president was no longer a shocking anomaly. It was proof that the office itself had become a strategic target. Lincoln had been killed not just because of personal hatred, but because he embodied the authority of the Union. His survival meant defeat for the Confederacy. His death was meant to weaken the system he represented. Although the nation endured, the lesson was unmistakable. The president was now a symbol whose removal could have enormous psychological and political consequences. Reconstruction tested this strengthened presidency in new ways. Ulysses S. Grant, a war hero turned president, faced the challenge of rebuilding a nation still hostile to itself. Federal troops were deployed to enforce civil rights laws, protect freed slaves, and suppress violent resistance. For the first time, the presidency was deeply involved in reshaping society from the top down. This expansion of authority unsettled not only former Confederate states, but foreign observers as well. A government capable of imposing order across such a vast and divided territory was not weak, it was consolidating power. At the same time, the United States was undergoing a rapid industrial transformation. Railroads, steel, oil, and finance reshaped the economy at breathtaking speed. Presidents increasingly found themselves mediating between massive corporate interests and public unrest. Labor strikes erupted, wealth concentrated in unprecedented ways. Though Congress passed laws, it was the president who became the visible referee of American capitalism. Foreign governments and investors watched closely. Stability or chaos in the United States could ripple outward, affecting global markets and trade networks. As American industry grew, so did its global reach. As companies sought markets abroad, and with them came diplomatic pressure. While the nation officially claimed to avoid imperialism, its actions often told a different story. Presidents began protecting American business interests overseas, sending gunboats, negotiating unequal treaties, and using military force when necessary. The presidency was no longer confined by borders. Decisions made in Washington now had consequences in Asia, Latin America, and the Pacific. This growing reach changed how foreign nations calculated their strategies. It was no longer enough to deal with the United States as a distant republic. The president had become the central figure through which American power flowed. Challenging American influence increasingly meant confronting the executive branch directly. Diplomatic tensions hardened, suspicion grew. The idea that the president was merely a ceremonial leader faded completely. The close of the 19th century also marked a psychological shift. America began to see itself and be seen by others as a rising power destined for global influence. The Spanish-American War crystallized this reality. In a matter of months, the United States defeated a European empire and acquired overseas territories. The president authorized military action, negotiated peace, and presided over the birth of an American empire in all but name. To the rest of the world, this was a shock. The former colony had become a colonizer. With overseas territories came permanent military presence abroad. Naval bases, garrisons, and coaling stations extended American reach. The president now commanded forces not just to defend the homeland, but to project power far from it. This inevitably created enemies. Local resistance movements viewed the American president as an occupier. Rival empires viewed him as a challenger. The presidency had crossed a threshold into global confrontation. At home, political tensions intensified. Assassination was no longer unthinkable. In 1881, President James Garfield was shot by a disgruntled office seeker, dying months later from his wounds. 20 years later, William McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist who saw him as a symbol of imperial oppression. These killings reinforced a grim truth. As the presidency grew more powerful, it attracted not only admiration, but radical opposition. The office itself had become a lightning rod for anger, ideology, and violence. Foreign governments absorbed this lesson carefully. If assassins and extremists could strike the American president, then the office was not invulnerable. More importantly, the impact of such attacks demonstrated how deeply centralized American power had become. One man's death could alter policy, strategy, and global relationships overnight. For adversaries, the presidency now represented both a threat and an opportunity. By the dawn of the 20th century, the transformation was complete. The American president was no longer a cautious administrator of a fragile union. He was the commander of armies, the guardian of economic expansion, and the face of a nation stepping confidently onto the world stage. His decisions could topple governments, open markets, and redraw maps. With that power came fear, resentment, and resistance. This era laid the foundation for everything that followed. It proved that the presidency could survive assassination, absorb crisis, and emerge stronger. It showed foreign powers that America's leadership was resilient, but also increasingly centralized. And it taught a dangerous lesson. If you wanted to challenge the United States, you no longer needed to fight all of America. You needed to confront the man at its center. As the 20th century opened, the American presidency stepped fully into a role its founders never imagined: global leadership. The nation's economic strength, industrial output, and military capacity had grown too large to remain contained within its borders. The president was no longer simply reacting to events. He was shaping them. With this shift came a new kind of attention from the world, less curious, more cautious, and increasingly confrontational. Theodore Roosevelt made no effort to disguise this transformation. He believed the presidency was meant to be powerful, active, and visible on the world stage. Under his leadership, the United States built a modern navy, asserted influence across the Western Hemisphere, and openly intervened in foreign affairs. Roosevelt's philosophy was blunt: speak softly and carry a big stick. For foreign nations, the message was unmistakable. The American president was prepared to use force to protect national interests. Negotiations with the United States now came with an implicit threat, backed by steel and firepower. This assertive posture hardened international perceptions. Latin American countries in particular began to associate the American presidency with intervention and control. The Roosevelt corollary expanded the Monroe Doctrine from a warning into a justification for direct involvement. Presidents could now claim the right to intervene in the affairs of neighboring nations to preserve stability as defined by Washington. To those on the receiving end, the president became less a partner and more a policeman. World War I further elevated the office. When Woodrow Wilson led the United States into the conflict, he did so not merely as a military decision-maker, but as a moral voice. He framed the war as a struggle for democracy and self-determination. For the first time, a U.S. president spoke not just for America, but for a vision of the world itself. Wilson's speeches resonated globally, inspiring movements and unsettling empires. His words alone carried immense power, proving that the presidency could shape ideology as effectively as armies. Yet this moral leadership came with consequences. When the war ended, Wilson attempted to redesign the international order through the League of Nations. Although domestic opposition weakened his efforts, the precedent was set. Foreign governments now expected American presidents to play a central role in global governance. Refusal or withdrawal could be as destabilizing as intervention. The presidency had become indispensable and therefore resented. The interwar years revealed how fragile this global role could be. Economic collapse, rising nationalism, and political extremism spread across continents. Although the United States initially retreated into isolation, the presidency remained a focal point of global expectation. Even in absence, American power cast a long shadow. Other nations feared what the United States might do or fail to do under presidential direction. That tension exploded with World War II. Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency redefined executive power on an unprecedented scale. Faced with global war, Roosevelt centralized authority, mobilized industry, and coordinated vast military operations across multiple theaters. The president became the ultimate wartime manager, directing not just troops, but economies and alliances. Foreign leaders now negotiated with Roosevelt as an equal or deferred to him as a superior. The presidency had become a command hub for the fate of nations. Nothing symbolized this power more starkly than the atomic bomb. When Harry Truman authorized its use, the world crossed a line from which it could never return. The American president now held the capacity to destroy entire cities in seconds. This was not abstract power. It was immediate and terrifying. From that moment on, the presidency was inseparable from the threat of nuclear annihilation. Allies depended on the president for protection. Enemies feared him as an existential danger. The end of World War II did not bring relief. It brought division. As the Cold War emerged, the presidency became the central node in a global standoff. Truman's decisions shaped containment strategies, military alliances, and nuclear deterrence. The president's authority expanded again, justified by the constant possibility of catastrophe. Emergency became normal. Extraordinary powers became permanent. Foreign governments adjusted their strategies accordingly. Some aligned closely with the United States, tying their security to presidential decisions. Others opposed American influence, framing the president as an imperial force imposing its will. In both cases, the presidency became the target of admiration dependence, fear, and hostility. It was no longer possible to separate American leadership from the individual who occupied the Oval Office. By mid-century, the transformation was complete. The American president was not merely a national leader. He was a global figure whose choices could shape peace or provoke war. Every speech, every alliance, every threat carried weight far beyond U.S. borders. With such influence came inevitable opposition. Rival powers sought to undermine presidential authority. Movements arose in defiance of American-led order. The presidency itself became a symbol of stability to some, domination to others. This era cemented a reality that would define the modern world. The United States could no longer retreat without consequence, and the president could no longer act without global reaction. Power had concentrated into one office, one voice, one decision-maker. And as that power grew, so did the number of those who watched, feared, and ultimately sought to challenge it. By the time the Cold War settled into place, the American presidency had evolved into something unprecedented. A single office holding the fate of the world in its hands on a daily basis. The destruction of World War II had left Europe shattered and much of Asia in ruins, while the United States emerged economically intact and militarily dominant. Opposite it stood the Soviet Union, armed with its own ideology, its own ambitions, and eventually its own nuclear weapons. From this moment forward, every American president governed under the shadow of global annihilation. Harry Truman was the first to face this reality. His decisions established the architecture of the Cold War military alliances, permanent overseas bases, and a national security state built around constant readiness. NATO, the Marshall Plan, and the policy of containment placed the president at the center of a worldwide strategy to limit Soviet influence. These were not symbolic gestures. They bound dozens of nations to American leadership and made the president the ultimate guarantor of their security. For adversaries, this meant that opposing U.S. dominance required undermining the presidency itself. As the nuclear arms race accelerated, presidential authority expanded even further. The power to launch nuclear weapons was concentrated in one individual, justified by the need for speed and secrecy. This reality terrified allies and enemies alike. A single decision, made in minutes, could end millions of lives. Foreign intelligence agencies began studying not just American military capabilities, but the psychology, habits, and weaknesses of the president. The office was no longer just a political institution, it was a strategic target. John F. Kennedy's presidency brought this danger into sharp focus. The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed how close the world came to destruction and how much depended on presidential judgment. For 13 days, the fate of civilization rested on decisions made inside the White House. Kennedy's calm, restraint, and willingness to negotiate prevented catastrophe. But the lesson was chilling. The world survived because one man chose not to escalate. From that moment on, the presidency was viewed globally as both protector and potential executioner. Kennedy's assassination deepened this perception. Whether driven by domestic or international forces, the impact was global. Markets trembled, allies panicked, enemies recalculated. The death of a U.S. president proved that even in the nuclear age, leadership could be violently disrupted. For those who opposed American power, the assassination reinforced a dangerous idea. Destabilizing the presidency could destabilize the world order itself. As the Cold War stretched on, presidents increasingly relied on covert power. The CIA became an extension of presidential will, operating in secrecy across the globe. Coups, assassinations, propaganda campaigns, and proxy wars unfolded in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Officially, the United States denied direct involvement. In reality, these actions were often approved at the highest level. To many nations, the American president came to represent hidden manipulation rather than open diplomacy. Vietnam exposed the limits of this power. Lyndon Johnson and later Richard Nixon commanded immense military force, yet struggled to achieve victory against a determined opponent. Televised war brought presidential decisions into living rooms, eroding public trust. Abroad, Vietnam became a symbol of American overreach. Protests erupted worldwide. For the first time, the legitimacy of presidential authority was openly questioned on a global scale. Richard Nixon responded by reshaping presidential power yet again. Through détente, he sought to reduce tensions with rival powers, while simultaneously expanding covert operations and executive secrecy. Watergate ultimately revealed how far the presidency had drifted from its original constraints. When Nixon resigned, the world watched in disbelief. The most powerful leader on earth had been brought down not by foreign enemies, but by abuse of power at home. For adversaries, this was proof that internal fracture could weaken American leadership more effectively than direct confrontation. Yet, even after scandal, the presidency endured. Under Ronald Reagan, the office regained confidence and assertiveness. Reagan framed the Cold War as a moral struggle, portraying the Soviet Union as an evil empire. Military spending surged. Rhetoric hardened. But behind the scenes, negotiations continued, culminating in arms control agreements that reduced the nuclear threat. Once again, the fate of global peace hinged on presidential relationships and personal diplomacy. Throughout the Cold War, one pattern remained constant. The American president was never merely reacting to events. He was shaping the environment in which all nations operated. Economic sanctions, military aid, ideological influence, and cultural power flowed outward from the White House. Countries aligned with the United States flourished under its protection. Those that resisted often faced isolation, intervention, or collapse. By the time the Cold War ended, the presidency had survived nuclear brinkmanship, assassination, scandal, and war. It emerged not diminished, but entrenched at the center of global power. The collapse of the Soviet Union left the United States without a peer rival, and the president without an equal counterpart. This unipolar moment created both opportunity and danger. With fewer restraints, presidential decisions carried even greater consequences. For the rest of the world, the lesson of the Cold War was clear. The American presidency was no longer just influential, it was decisive. Challenging U.S. dominance meant confronting the executive authority that directed its military, economic, and ideological reach. And as long as that authority remained concentrated in one office, the presidency would remain not only the most powerful position on earth, but also one of the most heavily targeted. When the Cold War ended, many believed the age of global confrontation had finally come to a close. The Soviet Union collapsed, nuclear tensions eased, and the United States stood alone as the world's dominant power. For the first time in modern history, there was no rival superpower to balance American influence. This moment fundamentally reshaped the presidency. Without an equal adversary, the American president became the undisputed center of global decision-making, and with that dominance came new forms of resistance. The first test of this unchallenged power came in the Middle East. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, President George H.W. Bush responded with overwhelming force, assembling a massive international coalition and launching the Gulf War. The conflict was swift and decisive, showcasing the United States' military superiority. For allies, it was reassurance. For adversaries, it was a warning. The American president could mobilize global support, command advanced weaponry, and enforce international order with remarkable speed. From this point forward, Middle Eastern politics became deeply entangled with presidential authority in Washington. Yet military victory did not bring stability. The continued presence of U.S. troops in the region, combined with sanctions and political pressure, fueled resentment. For many in the Middle East, the American president became synonymous with foreign interference, economic suffering, and the defense of authoritarian allies. The image of the presidency shifted again, not as a distant power, but as an active force shaping daily life across borders. This resentment would soon return in devastating ways. During the 1990s, President Bill Clinton navigated a world defined by economic globalization. Trade agreements, financial institutions, and technological expansion placed unprecedented influence in presidential hands. Decisions made in Washington affected currencies, labor markets, and national budgets worldwide. At the same time, the United States increasingly relied on targeted military actions, airstrikes, sanctions, and covert operations to manage crises without full-scale war. To critics, this reinforced the perception of an unaccountable presidency wielding power without consequence. Then came September 11, 2001. In a matter of hours, the presidency was transformed once again. The attack shattered any illusion of security and thrust President George W. Bush into a new kind of war, one without clear borders or timelines. The War on Terror expanded executive authority to levels unseen since World War II. Surveillance, detention, military intervention, and emergency powers became normalized. The presidency assumed a global security role, claiming the right to strike threats anywhere in the world. The invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq cemented this transformation. The president now directed wars of choice as well as necessity, reshaping entire regions through force. For supporters, these actions were defensive and necessary. For opponents, they were evidence of imperial ambition. Around the world, protests erupted against American leadership. The presidency became a symbol not just of power, but of domination. Resistance to the United States increasingly focused on the individual at its helm. These conflicts also revealed the limits of presidential authority. Despite overwhelming military strength, the United States struggled to impose lasting stability. Insurgencies, sectarian violence, and regional chaos followed. Each failure eroded the image of presidential omnipotence and fueled further hostility. For extremist groups, targeting the American president, physically or symbolically, became a way to challenge U.S. influence on a global stage. As the decade progressed, the costs of perpetual war weighed heavily on the presidency. International trust declined. Allies questioned American judgment. Rivals exploited U.S. overextension. The office remained powerful, but increasingly isolated. Decisions made by the president reverberated instantly through media and markets, magnifying both successes and mistakes. The election of Barack Obama signaled a shift in tone, but not in responsibility. Obama inherited wars, surveillance systems, and a global counterterrorism apparatus. While seeking diplomacy and restraint, he also expanded the use of drones and targeted killings, placing life-and-death decisions even more directly in presidential hands. To many abroad, the methods changed, but the dominance remained. The presidency continued to operate above borders, accountable primarily to itself. Throughout this period, one reality became unavoidable. Control over oil routes, trade corridors, and military bases tied American presidents deeply to the Middle East and beyond. Energy markets rose and fell based on presidential decisions. Sanctions crippled economies. Alliances shifted with elections. The office had become not just a political institution, but a central pillar of the global system. For nations affected by these policies, the American president was no longer an abstract figure. He was a constant presence deciding wars, enforcing economic punishment, and shaping regional futures. Opposition to U.S. power increasingly personalized itself against the presidency. Protests, propaganda, cyber threats, and terrorism all focused on challenging the authority of the White House. By the end of this era, the lesson was clear. The fall of a rival superpower had not made the world safer or simpler. It had concentrated power even further in the hands of the American president. And as that power extended into every corner of global politics, it ensured that resistance, resentment, and targeting would continue to grow alongside it. As the world entered the digital age, the nature of power began to change once again. Armies and missiles still mattered, but information, perception, and influence became just as decisive. For the American presidency, this shift created a new battlefield, one without borders, uniforms, or clear rules. The president was no longer just a military and political leader. He became a constant presence in a global information war where every word, image, and decision could be weaponized in real time. Barack Obama's presidency unfolded at this turning point. His election itself carried symbolic weight around the world, signaling change, diversity, and renewed American engagement. But symbolism did not reduce the burden of power. The presidency now operated in a hyper-connected world where diplomacy happened publicly. Conflicts unfolded online, and foreign audiences reacted instantly. Social media transformed the president into a global broadcaster, whether he intended it or not. Every speech reached millions beyond U.S. borders, shaping opinions far removed from American shores. This visibility made the presidency more influential and more vulnerable. Foreign governments no longer needed spies alone to understand American leadership. They could analyze public statements, online reactions, and domestic divisions in real time. Cyber capabilities emerged as a new tool of state power. Hacking, data leaks, and disinformation campaigns became methods of undermining presidential authority without firing a shot. Targeting the presidency now meant targeting trust itself. The rise of cyber warfare exposed a dangerous asymmetry. The United States possessed unmatched military strength, but its open political system made it susceptible to manipulation. Elections, public confidence, and presidential legitimacy became strategic objectives for foreign actors. Attacking the credibility of the president could weaken American influence more effectively than challenging its military. This marked a profound shift. The presidency was no longer just physically protected, it had to be defended psychologically. These dynamics intensified during the presidency of Donald Trump. His unconventional communication style, direct engagement on social media, and rejection of traditional norms reshaped the global image of American leadership. Allies struggled to predict policy. Rivals tested boundaries. The presidency became a source of constant controversy, drawing unprecedented global attention. For adversaries, this unpredictability was both an opportunity and a risk. Trade wars, sanctions, and public confrontations replaced quieter diplomacy. Presidential decisions sent shockwaves through global markets within minutes. Tweets moved currencies, announcements altered alliances. Never before had the personal voice of a president carried such immediate economic and political impact. This personalization of power further concentrated attention on the individual rather than the institution. At the same time, foreign interference reached new levels. Intelligence agencies accused rival states of attempting to influence elections, amplify divisions, and erode trust in democratic processes. The target was not a single policy, but the legitimacy of presidential authority itself. If citizens could be convinced that the president was illegitimate or corrupt, the entire system could be destabilized from within. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed both the reach and the limits of presidential power in the digital age. Decisions made by the White House affected global supply chains, public health strategies, and economic stability worldwide. Yet the crisis also exposed fragmentation, misinformation, and political polarization. The presidency became a focal point for blame, fear, and expectation on a planetary scale. Throughout this era, one reality became increasingly clear. The American president now governed not only through laws and force, but through narrative. Control of the story mattered as much as control of territory. Foreign governments invested heavily in shaping perceptions of American leadership, knowing that global opinion could constrain or empower presidential action. In this environment, targeting the presidency rarely meant physical assassination. It meant erosion of credibility, unity, and confidence. Cyber attacks, leaks, propaganda, and economic pressure all aimed to weaken the president's ability to lead effectively. The battlefield had shifted from land and sea to screens and minds. By the end of the 2010s, the presidency stood at a crossroads. It remained the most powerful office on earth, yet also one of the most exposed. Every decision was scrutinized globally. Every mistake was magnified instantly. The office had never been more influential or more contested. This chapter marked the culmination of a long transformation. The American presidency had evolved from a restrained executive into a digital age command center, operating under constant observation and attack. And as the tools used against it grew more sophisticated, so too did the reasons why foreign powers continued to target it. In a world defined by information, the presidency itself had become the ultimate signal and the ultimate vulnerability. By the time the 21st century matured, the American presidency had become both unparalleled in power and endlessly contested. It was no longer sufficient to understand the office as a national institution. It had become a global symbol, a focal point for admiration, fear, and resentment. To many countries, the president was the embodiment of American influence military, economic, ideological, and technological. Challenging the president had become a way to challenge the United States itself, without necessarily confronting the nation directly. This duality, power and vulnerability, defines the modern presidency. The office controls armies capable of striking anywhere on the globe, commands an economy that drives international markets, and influences the rules of trade and finance worldwide. Presidents negotiate treaties, impose sanctions, and shape alliances that can lift or crush nations. At the same time, they operate in a world of instantaneous communication, cyber threats, and global scrutiny. Every statement, every tweet, every policy is analyzed and exploited by both allies and adversaries. The presidency is now as much a psychological and symbolic target as a political one. The reasons foreign powers target American presidents today are multi-layered. Military dominance ensures that a president's decisions directly affect the strategic calculations of other nations. Economic control gives the United States the ability to isolate, reward, or punish governments. Ideological influence allows the president to project American values, democracy, capitalism, human rights onto the global stage, sometimes clashing with entrenched regimes. History has shown that the United States has intervened to remove foreign leaders, topple governments, or support favored factions, making presidential decisions a source of deep anxiety abroad. And cultural power through media, entertainment, and technology creates a perception of the president as a living symbol of American global reach. These dynamics explain why opposition to the presidency takes so many forms. Some nations respond with overt military posturing, economic sanctions, or cyber warfare. Others employ subtle tactics, propaganda, political influence operations, or support for groups opposing American interests. Non-state actors, too, see the president as a target because striking at him or undermining his authority is a way to gain international attention and legitimacy. The individual occupant of the White House represents the entire U.S. system, making the office itself a proxy battlefield. Yet this focus on the presidency is not solely external. Domestic division amplifies vulnerability. Political polarization, partisan conflict, and media scrutiny magnify every decision, turning presidential actions into global spectacles. Adversaries exploit this reality, recognizing that weakening public confidence domestically can erode global credibility. In an interconnected world, the legitimacy of one leader affects perceptions of the nation itself. The concentration of power in a single office also creates extraordinary responsibility. Decisions that affect millions of lives, whether military strikes, economic sanctions, or international agreements, must be made quickly and decisively. The margin for error is small, and the consequences extend far beyond national borders. Every action is a statement, every inaction a signal, every public gesture a ripple across the globe. Foreign powers monitor, anticipate, and react. In this environment, targeting the president becomes the most efficient way to influence or challenge American policy. As we look at the presidency today, it is clear that the office is more than a symbol, more than an executive branch leader. It is a central node in the global system. It embodies power, responsibility, and risk all at once. Countries target the president not because of personal enmity, but because of the authority he represents and the decisions he can enforce. The modern presidency is an instrument of influence unmatched in history, and that influence inevitably attracts resistance. The story of the American presidency is, in essence, the story of power concentrated in one individual and the world's response to it. From the fragile beginnings under George Washington to the digital age authority of Barack Obama and beyond, the office has evolved in ways few could have imagined. And throughout that evolution, one constant remains. As long as the president commands the world's attention, nations will continue to measure, test, and sometimes attempt to undermine him. The presidency is a target because it is the ultimate expression of American power, and it has become, by design and by history, inseparable from the fate of the nation itself. In the end, the American president is both a guardian and a lightning rod. The office commands unparalleled influence, yet operates under scrutiny, threat, and expectation unlike any other position in human history. Every decision shapes global politics, every action is watched, and every misstep is amplified. This is why, for over 2 centuries, the world has been fascinated, fearful, and often hostile toward the man or woman sitting in the Oval Office. The presidency is not just a role. It is a stage upon which the entire world watches, reacts, and inevitably tests its limits.